Top stitching and understitching are two sewing techniques that can be used to secure your linings. Both techniques are used somewhat differently than in garment construction when it comes to bag making. So in this video, I'm going to go through how top stitching and understitching are used in the bag making process. First, let's go over top stitching. Top stitching is one of the top techniques needed for bag making. It's a stitch that appears on the exterior of your bag, and it typically goes through all of the layers, including the lining. While oftentimes it can be pretty decorative, especially if you use some really cool variegated threads, it actually has some very important construction uses. Namely, it keeps your linings in place so they don't have that poofy look. It also keeps the seam allowances from kind of flipping up and again, poofy look. Apart from using a slightly larger seam allowance for your lining construction, top stitching can also be used to give you a nice, tight, and crisp lining. It's especially important if you're sewing anything with zippers, because if you don't use top stitching, that lining could kind of like fold up and get caught in the zipper tape. It also adds an extra layer of security because it's an extra stitch that's along the main stitch line that's used for construction. Since the top stitch is on the exterior of the bag and goes through all layers, you do see it, and it creates this tiny little bump that's between the seam where it's been folded and the top stitch. Now, in domestic sewing machines and when you're doing garment construction, sometimes you need special needles. Top stitch specific needles have a larger eye and a deeper groove. This allows that needle to punch through more layers of fabric than you typically would when doing a construction stitch. The larger eye also helps with the timing of everything and capturing that bobbin thread to make the stitch. If you're using a semi-industrial or an industrial machine, you really don't need to worry about the special needles. When it comes to thread, you can use a completely different thread than what you're using to construct the bag with. That's also not a requirement. Personally, when I make bags, I'm always using Tech 70 or thicker threads. If I was just using plain old 40 weight all-purpose thread, yeah, I probably would recommend that you get something like a top stitch specific thread. The thicker thread is going to stand out and make the top stitch decorative as well as functional. And oftentimes humans have the tendency to conform and want to match the thread with the exterior fabric. However, you should explore all kinds of different design opportunities by using a contrasting thread or really cool variegated threads. When you do a top stitch, you want your stitch length to be longer. I usually go a full millimeter longer than what my construction stitch is. So if I'm using 3.5 millimeters, I want to go up to 4.5 millimeters just for the top stitch. This is because the top stitch is going to go through all of those layers, and you need to give the machine a little extra time to make the contact between the upper and the bobbin thread. That same rule applies to sewing with thicker fabrics in general. You can see on this bag how I've actually used a matching thread to go with the fabric as opposed to using something contrasting. For me, that was a design decision. The fabric I'm using for this bag is pretty obnoxious already. So if I'd used a contrasting thread color or even a variegated thread, it probably would have been really distracting. On the other hand, here's a bag where I used variegated thread that contrasts against the main fabric. For this bag, it was the inverse of the previous bag. The fabric is extremely plain, so I wanted to give it some character. I actually wanted the top stitches to stand out. Now let's go through understitching. For people who have experience sewing clothing, you probably understand what an understitch is. Unlike a top stitch, an understitch isn't going to be seen from the exterior. You really only see the understitch from the lining side of things. You make an understitch by sewing the lining to the seam allowance, leaving the exterior alone. Even though the understitch isn't visible from the exterior, it still serves a decorative purpose. You can choose to use an understitch to only tack down the lining and allow the edge of the exterior fabric to gently roll toward the inside of the bag. Sometimes you don't want that annoying little bump that basically comes with the top stitch. Take the backpack's gusset top stitch, for example. This thing has a pretty severe bump on it. That's because I'm using not only vinyl, but also foam on the inside as the interlining for this particular piece. If you don't want that bumpy look, that's when understitching is really good. And in fact, this bag pattern uses understitching for the front pocket if you do the 3D pocket option. That's because I don't want the seam where the pocket attaches to the main panel to poke out from the inside, and then the pocket doesn't lay correctly and the lining is all loosey-goosey looking. But I also didn't want double seams to show on the front because I also have a top stitch to make it look like I actually folded the edges under and attached it to the panel. That's just two scenarios that I can think of where understitching is useful in bag making, so what are some other ones? Lined slip pockets are another great option. If you're not using a super thick fabric, something that you can press or even roll down a bit, the understitch is perfect for a slip pocket. It's also wonderful for bag openings for things like tote bags, especially if you're using a thicker fabric like a vinyl or even leather. You can also use understitching when you're making zippered pouches instead of a top stitch along the zippered edge. I normally still top stitch around the zipper. I just don't top stitch the outer edges of it so that it is easier to assemble once I have to do that final construction stitch. Congratulations, you now understand the purpose of top stitching and understitching in bag making. If you have any questions or additional input, please leave it in the comments section below the video. For more video tips and tricks on bag making and other DIY crafty things, feel free to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.